your rest and digest system, which is your parasympathetic nervous system, so the other branch of your autonomous nervous system. And you get that activation because you submerge into cold water. And when you do that, you have an activation of your diving response, and that's going to slow down the consumption of oxygen also in your body, and that's going to slow down your heart rate.
Could I pause you on this? Because I've heard this before, that when we get into cold water, shower or immersion, we get this sympathetic autonomic response. So increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, release of norepinephrine from the locus ceruleus in the brain, release of adrenaline, dopamine, adrenaline from the adrenals, dopamine presumably within the brain. But that the parasympathetic response is activated when we put our face into cold water or go underwater. And that's a calming relaxation response. So this brings us back to, I don't want to take us off track from you describing the study, but this brings us back to the first question, which is, if I go completely underwater for a moment when I start my cold plunge, does that change the physiological outcome as compared to if I just submerge myself up to the neck? And actually nowadays it seems to be a little bit of a movement online of people putting a bowl of ice water on their countertop and submerging their face into it. Did you see this? This is I've seen more and more posts about this. So could you just touch on what the dive reflex is and why it perhaps activates the parasympathetic response, this calming response?
Well, so the diving reflex is activated when you submerge into cold water.
Even just to the neck?
Yeah.
Or I thought you had to get your face under. I'm not arguing different. You're the expert. I just want to,
I haven't read that. I've just seen that you can activate your diving response as soon as you go underwater with your body. So you don't have to do it with your face, as far as I understand. I could be wrong, though. So when you activate your diving response, you will slow down your oxygen consumption in your body. And that is because the body tries to preserve oxygen, so you will not get hypothermic too fast. So it's kind of like a survival system in your body. So this survival system is very important for us, of course. So that will be activated. And because of that, you will, after maybe 1 minute or so, I can't be precise on that because maybe it also varies a bit in humans. So 1 to 2 minutes, you will have full activation of the sympathetic nervous system, but also the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's going to activate, for example, something like serotonin in your brain, which is like also good for mental balance, and people feeling in mental balance afterwards, after they go up. So that is like measured on a questionnaires, and also measure like on anecdotes. Of course, people tell all the time that they feel good afterwards. We need studies on this. So if anyone's sitting out there thinking that's interesting, then please do some studies on that.
Yeah, I agree.
To get more out on that. Yeah.
So you observe these winter swimmers who are done this for a few seasons.
Yeah.
They're coming around for a new season of winter swimming, and you've decided to recruit them as subjects. They are getting into cold water, climbing down a ladder or jumping into the water up to their neck.
Yeah, climbing. Yeah.
Okay, climbing down a ladder because this is done outdoors. What a fun study to do. My graduate thesis was done under fluorescent lights with no windows in a building that. I mean, I had a ton of fun as a PhD student. I actually lived in the laboratory as a PhD student. I loved it so much, but not something required to do a PhD, by the way. But they're climbing down the ladder.
Yeah.
Getting in up to their neck, staying in for 1 to 2 minutes, and then getting out. And how many times a week are they doing this?
So they do this 2 to 3 times per week. And for each time they go, each day they go, they take 3 rounds so 3 dips and 2 sauna sessions. So they start in the cold and they end in the cold water.
Okay, so it's get in for 1 to 2 minutes, then get out and get into the sauna.
Yeah.
What is the temperature of the sauna?
About 80 degrees Celsius.
Okay. Then how long are they in the sauna?
So they stayed there for 10 to 15 minutes. So depending on if they went 2 times per week or 3 times per week.
Okay. And then they get back into the cold for a few minutes.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Up to 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Then back into the sauna, 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Then back into the cold for a 3rd round.
Yeah.
Back into the sauna. And then they're
ending on the cold.
And then back into the cold again, and then ending on cold.
Yeah.
And we will talk about why it's important to end on cold, the so-called Søberg principle. How cold was the water in this particular, given average? Because I realize it's outdoor winter swimming, so it's going to vary depending on wind chill and things as well.
Of course. So it's a very uncontrolled environment to do this kind of study in, but I wanted to do something that was also very close to something people can do for free, going out in nature and use that, and also have the nature like it's a very healthy impact on us. It lowers our stress level as well. So by doing so, I also measured the temperature every time they went. So I have this graph, and it's actually in the winter swimming book. It shows the temperature in Denmark going like from October to April, and it's like starts at 12 degrees. I think it's around 12 degrees Celsius, the water, and then it goes down to 2 degrees on average in January, and then up again. So it's within the spectrum of very cold water, I would say from around 15 degrees Celsius and down, but it was actually not colder than like 2 to 4 degrees like in on average when it was the coldest. So it doesn't have to be that cold to be good enough and enough to activate our metabolism.
And what time of day are the participants doing this cold sauna alternation?
So I think they did this throughout the day. So I didn't control whether they wanted to go in the morning, in the afternoon, or in the evening. At the time where I set up this study, I was not controlling it in that way. I wanted them to go whenever they had time, and I also think that is the most important message to give to people is do it when you have time. It's not if doing it when you get home from work and it's 6 o'clock in the evening, and this is the time where you are where you can do it, then try out if it's going to impact your sleep or not. If it doesn't impact your sleep, then fine. But you have to try for yourself and find out what works for you. It's the same for coffee, for example, right? Some people can drink coffee in the evening and go to bed and they can sleep. I can't.
Or exercise.
Or exercise, exactly. Yeah. So I can't do that. And that's because the coffee, exercise, cold water, immersion, it's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. You have an increase in stress response in your body, and that's going to make it really hard to fall asleep, for some people at least. Maybe you are super exhausted anyways, and then you will just crash anyways. But yeah, but that's the only thing. So I just told them to do this if they can during the daytime, and that's primarily what they also did.
Mm-hmm. And then all along you're measuring brown fat by way of this infrared camera, right? So what did you observe in terms of changes in brown fat? How quickly did that occur? And then I'd like to ask also about sauna a bit more, because earlier you mentioned that you can activate brown fat with sauna as well, with heat on the surface, surface of the skin. How long did it take before you observed significant increases in brown fat? And was it increased density of brown fat or distribution? Was it, showing expansion to different regions throughout the body? And maybe you could also touch on some of the changes in insulin sensitivity and metabolism.
Yeah, a very good question. And I didn't mention this before, but besides measuring temperature as an outcome for brown fat activity, we also did PET MRI scanning of the brown fat. So this is like the golden standard for measuring brown fat. And it's not very feasible for normal people to get a PET CT or PET MRI scanning of the brown fat. Is super expensive. So we had both to see if we could have like a continuous measure of brown fat in humans, because that was already not out there. So I wanted to see during both the experimental days, but also during day and night, what kind of like circadian rhythm do we have in our brown fat activity? So that's why I wanted to have that as well. So the PET CT scanning or the PET MRI scanning was to see upon cold activation, stimulation for some hours. Do we have activation? Can we see the brown fat in this subject? And also during thermoneutrality or thermocomfortable state, how is that activated in each of the group, of course.
So you want to see how comfortable people were away from the cold water and sauna, just at different temperatured environments. Is that right?
Yeah, so I also measured that. How comfortable are you? I made this scale, like visual analog scale, and asked them, how comfortable do you feel with this temperature? And throughout the study days during cold exposure and thermocomfortable day, I had a whole day where I just kept them thermocomfortable to see, do they activate the brown fat if they're just completely thermocomfortable? As good as we could get with that, because we were asking people on a scale from 1 to 10, and 5 being thermocomfortable, where are you on this scale? So 1 would be very cold and 10 would be super burning hot. And so that was a way to try to figure out how do they actually feel also during the studies. I also measured electromyography, of muscles to see, do they shiver during the cooling day? Sometimes people shiver before they know they're really shivering. So I had
interesting.
Yeah.
So our conscious perception of shivering might not be the best readout of shiver.
Yeah, well, if you also get adapted to the cold water, you will have less shivering. They will be less vigorous. They will be very small. So you wouldn't probably know that you are shivering because the shivering is so small, and the mitochondria in the muscle cells will be so dense that it doesn't need to shiver maybe that much to get that thermogenesis going, compared to when you're completely new to cold water exposure and you're not adapted. Then the body needs to create these mitochondria, these energy fabrics, to keep you warm, and that's also what the exercise is in the beginning. But when we measured this, we did see that the winter swimmers were shivering less or having less vigorous shivering when they said, I'm cold. So even though their perception of the cold was pretty similar in the groups, we could see that the activation of the muscles that we measured on were different and more vigorous in the control group.
Were the subjects incentivized to be in the study? Were they paid or anything of that sort? Or they just happened to like doing cold and sauna, and so that's why they did the study?
Well, they got paid a little bit for it, but not much. And that's how we do this study.
Sure. I was just curious.
Yeah,
I was just curious. There might be some folks that wonder. So what did you discover in terms of changes in brown fat, insulin resistance, or insulin sensitivity rather, and metabolism?
So what we saw was we had these kind of different measures to see to try and unravel what's actually going on when they are already adapted to the cold water compared to a control group who was matched on various parameters. We did see that the winter swimmers had an increased insulin sensitivity. They produced less insulin on all the experimental days. So besides from just cooling them and measuring the brown fat on each of these cooling days, or 2 cooling days and 1 thermocomfortable day, right? So I wanted to measure insulin when they were fasting, meaning that they hadn't eaten in 8 hours before the study day. And they were completely laying still, not moving, just in a bed. And we measured insulin during the experimental day just to see what level are they on. And we could see that the winter swimmer had lower production of insulin. And they also, when they had an glucose drink, so we give them that to see to test before we enroll them in studies to see if they have diabetes, for example, and not knowing, for example, that would like ruin maybe the study. So we test for that and see if they have like a normal curve. So what we did see in that was that the winter swimmers had a faster glucose clearance in the bloodstream. So after 2 hours, we could see that they had a lower level, and the curve went down faster than in the control group.
So despite having lower insulin release, they have better blood glucose clearance, which is really what you want, we all seek, right? Excessive insulin is bad. Insulin being a more or less a chaperone for blood glucose. Can do all sorts of other things as well, of course. But and having high blood glucose, obviously terrible for cells, especially brain cells. I don't think people realize how toxic high blood glucose is. Having high glucose is for brain. If you want to kill neurons, you make their put them in an environment where there's too much sugar.
Okay.
Very neurotoxic. I mean, that's and there are mechanisms like insulin that buffer that. We keeping blood glucose in a reasonable range so that that doesn't happen. I mean, I think that's why people will go into insulinemic shock. Hypoglycemic shock is also possible. So that range in which neurons are happy is not a tremendously large range. Incidentally, the range in which neurons are happy and surviving is much greater as one gets colder than when you heat up. I mean, you can basically destroy brain cells by getting too hot for too long.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You can definitely destroy brain cells permanently by getting too cold for too long, but you have to get really, really cold for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. We're thinking about doing an episode on sort of survival of the brain after death kind of things, which actually happens. You hear about these people who are declared dead and then come back. And there's actually now a lot of cryopreservation type approaches for that. Okay. This is, anyway, we risk going into the esoteric now. So I'll steer us back to our discussion about your study. But so if I do the math, these subjects are in the cold. Let's say they're doing 3 rounds of cold for 1 to 2 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week. What were the thresholds that you discovered were important for getting these positive changes in such as reduced blood sugar or clearance of blood sugar, being more efficient, reduced insulin, improved brown fat distribution and density? How much cold exposure do people need? How much heat exposure do people need in order to extract these benefits?
Yeah, so when we then calculated the numbers together, we could see that this ended up being 11 minutes in total per week. So not in one session, of course, but they had 2 to 3 visits to the water and the sauna per week. So when we divide that out, it corresponds to being in cold water 1 to 2 minutes at a time, but also in the sauna 10 to 15 minutes at a time. And I think this is very also similar to what we see in other studies when we look, for example, to the observational studies from the Finnish cohort study from Lauken et al. For example, they published this very amazing paper in 2015, some results from this long cohort study where they show that up to 30 minutes in the sauna was healthy, and you lower your risk of cardiovascular disease, and that's like the threshold. And if you go further than that, then there is not more healthy benefits to gain from that. So, and before that, it's like 19 minutes, then you will have this dose-response relationship up to 19 minutes. That's really in decreasing your risk of cardiovascular diseases. And I think
that's per week, 90 minutes per week.
90 minutes per session now.
Per session.
Yeah, per session. If we then compare that with my study, which was 10 to 15 minutes per session, then I think it fits very well with what we call the hormetic stress or healthy stress, that you expose the cells to this kind of like potent, very stressful situation where they increase heat shock proteins in the cells, and that will repair the cells. But if you then overdo it and you go beyond the maybe 30 minutes in the sauna, this observational study from Finland with more than up to 2,000 sauna bathers, where they followed these for 20 years, they see that 30 minutes per session is like enough. And if you go above that, you don't get more health benefits out of it. So I think there's a window where we can say the healthy stress corresponds to like 10 minutes. And I think it's like
per session.
Per session. Okay. And it's not much actually. So you don't need to, it shows that you don't have to expose yourself very much to the heat or very much actually to the cold to get this healthy benefits from going into cold, going to heat, and have healthy benefits on your cardiovascular system. So I think this is a very important also message to get out, that you don't have to go extreme. You don't have to swim for a half an hour in the cold water. You can go in the water for 1 to 2 minutes per session, but go up to 11 minutes per week in total. And for the sauna, my study showed 57 minutes in total per week. And if we also then divide it out on these 2 to 3 days, and 2 sessions each day correspond to 10 to 15 minutes. So it's a low threshold, but I think it's good to have that, to maybe we can aim for that if people need to have something to aim for. And I think it's really good to have that, because then you don't overdo it. And if you overdo it, you exhaust the cells, and that will increase your risk of cardiovascular disease also. So,
well, I get a lot of questions about this, and I did solicit for questions for this podcast on Twitter. And one of the questions that I got was, as one becomes more cold adapted, do the benefits start to wear off, or can people do too much cold exposure? And of course, the answer to that is yes, you can become hypothermic, but I'm sensing a different answer now, which is, if I understand correctly, the threshold is 11 minutes total per week of deliberate cold exposure, divided into 2 or 3 sessions of maybe 1 to 3 minutes, depending on how long somebody stays in. And then 57 minutes, I want to be careful not to round up to an hour, but divided into maybe 3 20-minute sessions or so, so one doesn't have to be perfect as long as you get beyond that threshold.
Exactly.
But I wonder something, which is it the case that if somebody said, I'm just going to do one 11-minute session per week, that might actually not be as beneficial as dividing it up? Because what you told us earlier is that the hormetic response depends on having that cold shock. You actually don't want to become too cold adapted. I mean, once the blood pressure response drops down, so in minute 4, 5, and 6, you're getting very cold and you're shivering, but one is not getting the autonomic stimulus that they want. I guess I could liken this to if exercise worked in a way where it was only the first few minutes of exercise that really triggered the adaptation. Of course, this is not how it works, but in fact, probably quite the opposite. But if that were the case, then it's not simply the total amount of exercise, but dividing up the sessions into little bouts where every single time it acts as a stimulus.
Yes.
That seems to be the key here.
Yes.
This is very important because having watched the landscape of this on social media, but also in books and generally, I think you're the first person to really touch on this, that the goal is not to get so cold adapted that you can sit in for the full 11 minutes in one session, where the goal isn't to be able to do an hour of very hot sauna. If you want to, I suppose people could do it for other reasons. But if the goal is to improve these health metrics, then the idea is to keep the stimulus a stimulus.
Short, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, this also, I think there's practical feasibility, as you pointed out, because getting into a cold shower or cold immersion or natural body water for a couple of minutes is far less, challenging to most people than finding a full morning to go, spend there. But I've never really heard it articulated that the longer sessions might not be beneficial and might actually be detrimental. That's very important. Were there any other observations that you made that did not make it into the paper or that were kind of in the margin notes? In terms of psychological benefits or anything of that sort. There was this recent study on soldiers that talked about weight loss. It's sort of a controversial study for a lot of reasons. But one of the things they remarked in the paper was that there were a lot of psychological changes, improved buffering against anxiety. They even, the men and women in that study reported one of the significant effects was significantly improved sexual satisfaction. Of course, they didn't tell us what that meant for these subjects, but so we won't go there. But a number of subjective improvements. Was there anything that you observed or took note of in your study that perhaps didn't make the main abstract, but that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there was some, and I'm today I regret that I didn't measure on sleep, for example. I frankly didn't really think about that when I designed the study. So we were very much occupied with the metabolism, and kind of had the thought maybe this could impact sleep quality. And I wish I had the thought that why don't you just ask them in a questionnaire? But I asked them every morning, or every morning, it was not many mornings, just 2 mornings actually, we measured on. But the winter swimmers told us before I wrote them that they had a really good sleep quality. The control group also had that, but they told me on the day where we measured brown fat on a day and a night, for actually 2 days and 2 nights, they told me that they had a good night's sleep, but they also woke up. So it's just telling me that they also had like a quick wake up and then they fell asleep again. And the winter swimmers so they have a really good sleep. So it's like, and in general, they also say we sleep very well. I sleep very well. So it's anecdotally, in general, it corresponds to what I heard in my study, but nothing that I measured on, which could be fun to do in the future, but we didn't measure on sleep quality. That would have been a really good idea to do. They also told me that they were very comfortable when they were cold. They don't mind, winter swimmers, they don't mind going out, for example, in the cold with a t-shirt. They were also less scared of showing their skin. That was also one observation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So kind of a reduced social anxiety.
Yeah. They were just so comfortable in the lab. As you just mentioned before, coats on and everybody's running around. It was very busy, and all the other scientists out in the hallway, and also my supervisor had her office down the hallway, and one of the winter swimmers one day just got out of bed after have been in the study for 8 hours. It was a long day, right? He jumped out of the bed and had his clothes in the bathroom, and he went out completely naked. He didn't care. He just went out. It was like, oh.
Wait, so that's a side effect, perhaps, of getting too comfortable with the cold. We're not recommending that.
No.
Although in your book, you you dedicated some. Let me start that again. Although in your book, you dedicated some pages to naked winter swimming, or I should say, naked cold water exposure, as opposed to with bathing suit.
Yeah.
Are there any data on this? I'm sort of chuckling, but I think in most places in the United States, it's skinny dipping is not legal. Most public beaches. There are a few. In fact, where my laboratory before moving to Stanford was in San Diego, and at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, beautiful building, incredible science is done there. The beach right below that is called Black's Beach. Okay. And it's a known nude beach. And so whenever tourists were heading down the stairway there, I would, sort of let them know, especially if they had kids, I'd let them know, it's a nude beach of a particular genre. So I'd give them a little warning about what they could expect down below. It's in any event, those beaches are quite rare, in the United States, maybe compared to Europe. I don't know. But yeah, maybe. Yeah. So is there anything special about, clothless versus clothed, exposure?
Yeah, I think in that sense, we are a bit more free with this kind of but remember, we also had this winter swimming culture for hundreds of years in Denmark. Mm-hmm. And the oldest winter swimming clubs that we have, especially the one we have in Copenhagen, where I did my next study, which we haven't talked about, but, and it's also not published yet, but, in that winter swimming club, it's the oldest one we have, and it's huge. And they swim naked at this facility.
Men and women.
And they have sauna where they can go in together. Mm-hmm. And they also have the separate saunas. But it's very much a Danish thing. And I think it's good if people want that. Mm-hmm. And I had it in my book because people want to know if they have to swim with their bathing suit on, or if they can take it off, or what's the difference? Is there any difference in this? And if you ask me, there is no difference. Oh, if you have your little skinny bikini on, it's not going to do any difference to your cold exposure or your adaptation. It's not going to do any difference for your benefits, of course. But I think that it has something else. It has something to do with how you also observe yourself, how you observe your surroundings. And it's some sense of freedom in skinny dipping. So I think people in Denmark who does this they do the winter swimming because they feel free when they do this. They come home from work, they go to this club and they skinny dip and they feel like in touch with nature. And they have maybe done this their whole life. So this is an old tradition in Denmark in some of the clubs. But the newer clubs that are coming, they don't skinny dip. So everyone has bathing suit. I never skinny dip because there are people around, people with phones and taking pictures all the time. So this
different nowadays. Everything's recorded.
Yeah. And also this old tradition is also fading away because of that.
Yeah, I use sauna and cold at home, but when I travel, there's a banya. So Russian banya has hot sauna and cold plunge. There's one in San Francisco called Archimedes Banya, and that one is clothing optional. So some people are clothed, such as myself, and then other people are not. And it's co-ed most of the time. I think they have female separated evenings or something like that. And then the other banya is Spa 88, which is on Wall Street in New York, is an amazing banya as well. And these are starting to crop up in different cities, or maybe they've been there for a long time. And as deliberate cold exposure and sauna gets more popular, more people are using them. The one in New York that Spa 88 is always clothed. And it's interesting because, people hear naked or skinny dipping, and they might get certain ideas in mind. All these places are very well lit, and they all have a tone of kind of health. That is about the kind of health and wellness. I guess the point being that there's no requirement to do one thing or the other. Although in the studies that you did, obviously people were clothed. But I did pay attention to those pages in your book. I thought it was interesting that you put some dedicated passages in your book related to this. And I think
my publisher wanted that.
Oh, your publisher wanted that.
Yeah, it was not me. It was like my publisher really wanted to have a little discussion about that. So I was like, okay.
Well, I think it points to a larger theme, which is I think for a lot of people who already do these practices, there's no shock there.
Yeah.
For people that do not do deliberate cold exposure or sauna, I think that there is this idea perhaps that, these are traditions that are kind of fringe, or that they're and I want to cue that point, because there's so many things that are happening right now in biomedical research and medicine, serious quality peer-reviewed studies published in excellent journals like your paper on things like deliberate cold exposure, sauna, the use of particular supplements, natural herbs and supplements. I mean, there's an entire branch of the National Institutes of Health in the United States dedicated just to the study of supplements and behavioral interventions for health, like meditation and breath work. Really incredible. It's really incredible. And psychedelics, of course, being something that for a long time was part of a certain community and feel, and now is being, frankly, adopted by mainstream medicine, even pharma. So the times are changing. And so, yes, I think it's important to know that it's perfectly acceptable and encouraged to wear clothing. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one other thing that I wanted to mention, going back to your questions around if there were any observations in the studies which we really maybe haven't discussed yet, and maybe it's in the back of the paper and not mentioned that much, was one of the winter swimmers didn't have any brown fat when we measured him.
Zero.
And we do see this in previous studies as well, that some humans don't have any brown fat.
Did he carry a lot of white fat adipose tissue? Was he obese?
No, he wasn't. No, he was not obese, because that he would not have been in the study then.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. Yeah, yes, you mentioned this earlier. Yeah. Forgive me.
No, it's fine. But he was. But what I did observe before I knew that he didn't have any brown fat was that during the cooling experiment, where I cooled them for 2 hours before they go into the PET-CT scanner, he was not able to control his shivering like the winter swimmers could. So he got very cold very easily compared to the others. So. And I didn't know what was different about him, but we could, me and the 3 others who were working on the experiment, we were like, okay, what's going on? Because we turned down the temperature, but he started like shivering, and then we had to turn it up again. And it was just all over the place, the temperature. It wasn't that controlled like the others. It was pretty similar protocol. I could just do pretty much the same because they were same size and also same gender. So it was easier to like foresee what was going to happen and when will they start shiver. I quickly learned that. But with this subject, with this volunteer, it was just very much different. And then when we scanned him and didn't find any brown fat, I didn't even think about it. So when we scanned him and we didn't see anything, I told the PET-CT people to like, oh, you put up the wrong scanning.
Right, blame the technology.
Yeah, technology. It was like, this scanning looked like the thermoneutral day, the thermocomfortable day, where we also scanned them to see if they have any brown fat. So you have made a mistake, I was pretty sure. And they analyzed this scanning, and they just concluded, well, the scanning was fine. The experiment went well. It was just that he didn't have any brown fat. So he was like what we just in the paper called a brown fat negative. So he didn't have any. And in mice studies, it would be called a knockout. So it didn't have any brown fat. So what the observation with him, and I think that's interesting, is that he both shivered very early on and didn't regulate his temperature as well. He also told me that then he was like a 5 on the scale of how comfortable he felt with the cold. So it was from 1 to 10, and 5 being thermal comfortable, and 10 being very cold, and 1 very hot. So on this like scale up and down. And he was like more up and down on this scale than any of the others. It was an observation that I did. But we did see in his blood samples also that his blood samples looked a bit more like the control group. Also, his insulin levels were like the control group, so a little bit higher than the other winter swimmers. And he also had his blood glucose clearance was not as fast as the other winter swimmers. So he was like an outlier, what we call it. And in the analysis, we also had to take him out of the analysis because he was an outlier. So the results showing that the brown fat is more efficiently activated in the winter swimmers is without him having him in that group. But it didn't ruin the study. If I tried to put him in as well, and it didn't ruin the results or anything. But just to keep it more clear, we took him out of the analysis.
Yeah, so he was a mutant, a knockout. Yeah, and I'm sure they're out there. Very interesting. So if you shiver early, then perhaps you have less brown fat to begin with. Although it's hard to conclude from one person. That's sort of the implication there.
Or you haven't adapted to the cold. So you should build that up.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So in addition to looking at regulation of blood sugar, brown fat, metabolism, and so on, were there any markers that you examined in the deliberate cold exposure group as compared to controls that revealed to you that deliberate cold exposure could have additional benefits, say for immune system function, or for any function for that matter?
Yeah, so for we looked at inflammation. Of course, we measure the outcome of blood pressure and so on, but we also measured the IL-6 in the study just to see also an anti-inflammatory marker. So IL-6 went up, and it also follows with the IL-10. So that is like also very known in the literature. So we measured that, and I think it's very important to think about the cold exposure and the heat exposure as something that then lowers the inflammation in the body. And if we can do that, we will have an open door for preventing lifestyle diseases, right? So for type 2 diabetes, but actually also for some mental diseases as well. So as known as depression and anxiety, and also Alzheimer's disease, which are all associated in research, also newer research showing that that inflammation increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and Alzheimer's disease, neurological diseases. So if we can decrease inflammation in the body, we will decrease modern lifestyle diseases, but also these increasing mental diseases that we see in these modern lifestyle times. So I think that it's very interesting that we can go out in nature and we can use these natural stressors. And I don't want to have it sound very romantic or anything. It's just exposure to temperature, actually, just to cold or to heat, that is going to trick our body into a natural state again and reset it where the homeostasis, the balance is lost a bit. So the body is going to repair itself in that way. And I think it's beautiful that we can do that just by changing the temperature of our body. And although people are very scared of doing this, because in our times, we have been away from cold, away from heat, temperature for decades now, since we isolated our houses better, and we are more sedentary. We also sit more indoor. We don't move as much. So this very modern sedentary lifestyle has made us more temperature comfortable, just neutral. So no wonder, that obesity is increasing. We don't expose ourselves to the natural stresses that we did earlier on in our involvement, but also up until maybe the 70s, the 60s, where we started having more like comfortable lifestyles, right? And obesity increases in the 80s. We can see that from statistics. So I think that if we can take in cold and heat, and you mentioned other things also before, but of course exercise is very important here. And also a bit of fasting, actually, because it all increases the hormetic stress in the body. So it doesn't have to be other than natural stresses to the body, which then could keep us in that natural balance again.
Could we talk about what I refer to as the Søberg principle, which is to end on cold? And the reason I called it the Søberg principle is because in reviewing, oh, by the way, I wasn't a official reviewer of your paper, but I mean in reading and reviewing your paper for its after published contents, I noticed that you had people end on cold. And this has been a long-standing debate in the deliberate cold exposure community. Should you warm up with a warm shower afterwards or get back in the sauna? What should you end on cold or end on heat? And the Søberg principle says end on cold. As I understand it, in order to force your body to heat itself back up and thereby increase metabolism further still. Is that right?
Yes. So when you end on the cold, you force your body to heat up by itself. And that will require that you keep your brown fat activated and also your muscles, which is a good thing. It's a good collaboration to keep your thermogenesis up. And that's like an exercise, even when you go home. So in that way, you don't have to think about your cold exposure, dipping in your plunge, or open sea or what it is, as just an exercise that you do for 1 to 2 minutes and then it's over. If you end on the cold, you have an exercise for your body going on for hours afterwards. And that's not only on your metabolism, but it's also going to keep your neurotransmitters activated as well and increase that because your body is still cold. So you need that those neurotransmitters to activate the brown fat as well. So that's going to make your brown fat cells more efficient and also your muscle cells more efficient. So increasing mitochondria in the cells, which will then generate heat very fast. So if you have done this for a few times, so maybe 3, 4, 5 times, being new to this, but have tried it a few times, you will notice a switch where you feel that you get easily warmer and you can keep yourself warmer. And that is also what was shown in my study, is that the winter swimmers were physically warmer on the skin compared to the control group. So they
when they are out of the cold.
When they're out of the cold, just relaxing. And we tested this on the days where they were sleeping in the lab. So we could see that they had a more activation of the brown fat, a higher temperature. So probably because they also lose heat. They have a higher heat loss to the body compared to the control group because they have a more vascular skin because of the contrast of cold and heat. So they lose heat faster from the body during the day. But is that a bad thing? No, probably not, because that's going to keep your brown fat and your muscles a little bit activated. So you will have to, it has to work to keep you warm.
I would hypothesize that it also might lead to some of the subjectively reported improvements in sleep, because in order to fall asleep, you need your core body temperature to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees.
Yes.
So it's not just sufficient to be sleeping in a cold room and under the blanket. You also need your body temperature to drop.
Yes.
And so what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that by ending on cold and forcing oneself to heat up naturally, that increases the brown fat stores, which I sort of see as kind of like the oil in the candle of the furnace, that is thermogenesis. And that in turn leads to increased heat loss, which people might think, oh, I don't want to lose heat from the body. But there are times when you want to lose heat from the body. Basically, it sounds like what we want is to be a very efficient heating and cooling system.
Yes.
That it's not about being cold or being hot. It's really about keeping the system tuned well, keeping the oil in the candle, this brown fat functioning.
Yeah.
Could I ask one question about fed or fasted? Is there any, or rather, are there any known benefits of doing deliberate cold exposure and or sauna fasted versus after a meal, say within the last hour or something of that sort? I do my deliberate cold exposure first thing in the morning. Mm-hmm. So in general, I'm fasted because I don't eat until a little bit later in the day. Yeah. But what's known about that? And was that looked at in your study? I know you measured glucose, but that was as a separate test away from the cold.
Away from the cold, yeah. But I also tested glucose on the days on the cold. So we measured that as well on the cooling days. Specifically on fasting and fat, I don't know. I don't think that I've seen studies specifically on this.
Okay. More science needed. A number of people asked about the use of deliberate cold exposure to offset some of the symptoms of various diseases. Now, here we're not talking about curing disease. We're talking about offsetting symptoms. One question I've seen quite often is whether or not people with Raynaud's syndrome. This is a syndrome, and my high school girlfriend had this syndrome, and I'll never forget, we were at a school dance together, and this was when we first started dating, and she had Raynaud's, which leads to very poor blood flow to the extremities. And she was very cold, so she left to go to the bathroom and warm up her hands in the warm water. And I was left standing there at the dance, and people came up to me and asked, why I was there and who I was there with. And I kept telling them who I was with, and they didn't believe me because they couldn't believe that she would be with me. Made total sense if you knew me at the time. I was way out of my league with her at the time. I like to think eventually I caught up, but in any case, she was in the bathroom for about an hour. So at one point I did consider the possibility that she had just left, but indeed she hadn't. She warmed her hands back up. But people with Raynaud's suffer from this thing of very, very cold extremities. Their fingertips will even turn blue, as if they were starting to get frostbitten. It's quite dramatic. And that question gets asked whether or not there's any use of cold to try and increase the elasticity, the plasticity of the small capillaries and vessels. By everything you've described up until now, it seems like that would be a logical thing to do. And in addition to that, whether or not people with autoimmune conditions, people with any other types of conditions are known to benefit from deliberate cold exposure. I'm not aware of any studies, but I get asked about this a lot, and there were a lot of questions about this for you in the Twitter feed. Yeah,
thank you for those questions. Yeah. And I get them as well on social media. And I have to say that I haven't seen any studies directed on this outcome on measuring Raynaud's syndrome. I do know that it's not that rare, actually, a problem. And I know that many women, or more women than men, suffer from this. But logically, it would help them if they expose their hands to cold and also heat to make it more vascular. And I have heard from people saying that it had helped them, but also heard for some others saying it didn't help them. Mm-hmm. So studies are needed on this specific topic, I think. Mm-hmm. I hurt my hands when I go into the cold water, and I don't have this syndrome at all, but I keep my hands above the water.
You do?
Yeah. And I do that. Often I take a little bit of a swim, and then, of course, I have to have my hands in the water. But it helps me when I then get back to the jetty and then take my hands up, because then I can stand there for a little bit and get my 1 to 2 minutes exposure, and then I can go up, because then otherwise that would stop me from being in the water enough time as long as I would like to. So if people suffer from having this pain in the fingers, and it can be very intense. Mm-hmm. So just take the hands up a bit from the water, and that's going to help you. Also boots, neoprene boots, it's going to help on the feet. Some people have feel the pain in the feet or in the ankles, and that's going to help them also a little bit.
Okay, so there is no problem with keeping hands out or feet in neoprene booties if people feel the need to do that. If that's pain of the hands or feet is a barrier for people doing deliberate cold exposure, then it seems it would be okay to do to keep hands out or to keep your feet in booties.
Yes, because then you do get the exposure. But of course, hands and feet are very potent places in your body to get a fast activation of your nervous system, of course. But if you can also just dip them and then take them up. It's still gonna activate that. But your full body is covered in cope receptors. You'll have a full activation anyways. So you are providing very reassuring information to people, because I know a number of people that do not like to put their hands in. I find that the more of my body I get in, the more comfortable I am. I don't know if it's psychologically and or physiologically. I find that
if where there's an interface between the water and the cold, it's most uncomfortable. So I prefer to just get everything under. I keep my head out. Although these days I've been dunking all the way in and then coming out and then dunking once more with my head under before I get out after the plunge. That raises a different question. Now we're getting into kind of the practicalities of deliberate cold exposure, which I think are important. Sometimes I'll experience, and I hear from a lot of people, that they'll get a kind of back of the head headache at the interface of the water, when they're doing cold immersion to the neck.
Okay.
I assume this has to do with blood flow, that there's vasoconstriction right up until the neck and in the region surrounding it, but that maybe there's still blood flow to the head. But do we know what the origin of these headaches is? And again, this doesn't happen for everybody, but some people do experience them.
Okay. Yeah. I haven't really heard about that one specifically. But I would say that there are different reasons for maybe keeping your head out of the water, but it seems like maybe for some that could be a reason for like just getting like a quick head dunk.
Going all the way in once. Yeah. That's what I've started doing to eliminate. I wasn't getting headaches, but I noticed that interface.
Okay.
And I wasn't in the rest of the experience of it so much. So I started dunking all the way in. I noticed in some of the photos that you've put out and in your book that you'll sometimes wear a cap while you go in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And well, it comes from different reasons. So let's talk about some of the physiological reasons. So when you submerge in cold water up to the neck, studies have shown, and this is from Denmark, studies from Bispebjerg Hospital, that when you submerge into cold water up to the neck at 0 degrees, so 0 degrees Celsius, very cold, you will have a decreased blood flow to the brain by around 30 to 40%. And makes sense because you activate the sympathetic nervous system, and therefore you will have a less blood flow to the brain. It makes you maybe a little bit dizzier. And
proof again that you need a heart more than a brain, because when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, blood flow is maintained to the heart to keep you alive, but obviously taken away from the brain to keep you from thinking. That's why it's hard to think when you're stressed.
Yeah, well, the muscles and your vital organs you have to be able to run away from that tiger, right?
The rationale makes total sense. And who am I to disagree with Mother Nature? Yeah, right.
Well, but yeah, so one of the reasons being that you should keep your head out of the water is that you could increase that decrease in blood flow to the brain further if you dunk the head. Mm-hmm. So there's this very nice paper from a research group in Canada, where they have collectively looked at different papers where they compared heat loss in the papers where they dunked the head and compared to heat loss submerging up to the neck to see how much extra heat do we lose from our core when we dunk the head. So, and I think it's very interesting that if you submerge up to the neck, you have a heat loss of 11% from the body core. And when you then also dunk the head, you will increase that heat loss rate by 36%. Wow. So that means I'm not saying that I'm not here to say what is right and what is wrong. I just think that people should know the information so they can for themselves evaluate what is best for them. But if you increase your heat loss rate by 36% from your core, that's going to increase your after drop, which we touched upon a little bit earlier, even further. So that's meaning that you are closer to hypothermia than you are if you just submerge up to the neck. So you should really think about whether this is like something that you want to do, or if it's just better for you not to get that cold in your core. The beanie is also because I have a little bit of sensitive ears. So meaning that if there's wind, and because we swim in the open sea in Denmark, we have a lot of wind. Our conditions are just very rainy, very windy. And when the temperature is also freezing, you could get this, what is that called? So very cold and lightheaded just from wind. So if you also submerge into cold water and you then get up, you will get a brain freeze immediately. Yeah. So it is enough to just go up to the neck, wear a beanie to just not get dizzy also, because the heat loss is increased, of course, but also the blood flow to the brain has decreased. So the beanie will keep you a little bit warmer so you can stay for 1 to 2 minutes. So it's just a way of like getting around some of the conditions also. So people can choose that if they feel that, but it's quite normal to do in Scandinavia, wear a beanie.
Love it. And so for those of you afraid of doing a 2-minute cold shower, what Dr. Søberg just described, you see how she and others are capable of doing things far harder than that. When the way you describe it with the cold wind in Scandinavia and is quite striking. Along the lines of covering the head, there's this seemingly paradoxical thing of people going into hot saunas and wearing wool caps. You know, if you go to a banya or you go to a sauna, and there are people who are from Eastern Europe, or typically, or Finland, or Russia, or Ukraine, or elsewhere, what you'll see is that many of them are wearing wool caps in the sauna, which many people think is to make it hotter. That's actually not the case. It actually insulates you from the heat environment. The sense of urgency to get out of the hot sauna is a brain-driven mechanism. And so the reason that people wear wool hats in the sauna is it actually lets you stay in the sauna longer, because it takes a lot of heat to the skin before you feel that you have, quote unquote, have to get out. Whereas so when you insulate the brain, you don't get that signal. It's pretty interesting. I've tried this before just by putting a towel over my head in the sauna, and you can stay in there much more easily and for much longer. As we talk about these different stimuli for the hormetic response, the adaptation to stress, it occurs to me that the big ones in our evolutionary history have been light, right? I mean, you were talking about seasonal changes. We know there, especially as you go up to Nordic countries, there are seasonal changes in the amount of light by time of year, dramatic ones, in fact.
Chasing dreams by the sea, echoes of a distant melody. In the nights, just you and me. Photographs and shades of gold, stories that we've never told, memories that never grow old. In this heart, they're always bold. Time moves on, but we stay here. In the moments crystal clear, echoes of the yesteryear. In our hearts we hold them near. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. Walks through streets of neon glow, silent whispers, tales of woe. In the dark our secrets show. In this art our love will grow. Time moves on, but we stay here. In the moments crystal clear, echoes of the yesteryear. In our hearts we hold them near. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. In the twilight, shadows play, awful whispers, tales of woe. In the hearts we find our say. In the dawn
ones.
Less so at the equator, of course.
Yeah.
Light, temperature, food, movement. It's sort of interesting. And at the same time, perhaps it should have been obvious to us that there are stimuli that our bodies have evolved to adapt to in very powerful ways. And so the idea that temperature, heat and cold could evoke these tremendous physiological changes that are beneficial for us probably shouldn't surprise us at all. No. I mean, this is why these are not esoteric mechanisms. They're actually the foundational mechanisms by which our body and the bodies of other animals adapt. So I do have a question about the different ways that people could approach deliberate cold exposure. So for instance, children. I've been to banyas where there are kids, 6 or 7 years old with their parents at the banya. And so they're in hot sauna. I'm not suggesting people do this if they're not, adapted to it, and, talk to your parents' kids and talk to your kids' parents, talk to your doctors. But it is remarkable. I mean, children doing sauna from a young age or deliberate cold exposure. Are there any data on this? And is it safe, assuming that, obviously that they can swim or they're doing this in a tub or shower? And then I'd also like to ask you about, are there any additional male-female differences? I know your study focused on men, but other studies have focused on both. And you, of course, are a woman and can attest to your own experience with this. So children, men, women, differences there in terms of protocols. Is there anything that people should build into the structure of their deliberate cold exposure that's unique to that?
So this was on cold exposure. So, I think that starting with the question about children, I think that it's important to think about, as children are smaller than adults, so we cannot really completely transfer all the information and the benefits and also protocols for how long and stuff like that to children. We cannot do that because they are just smaller in mass. And one study that actually proves this is a study where they have compared heat loss in children, boys who were 12 years old, compared to adults, men, and looked at heat loss of the core temperature and exposed them to a 1 or 2 minutes cold exposure, so immersion up to the neck. And what they saw was that the boys in this study could actually defend their core temperature in the same way as the adults could, but they had to use their muscles way faster. So it means that they couldn't stay for as long, and they use more energy to defend their core temperature compared to the adults. But for 1 minute, it seems that they could actually, but they will be colder when they then come out because they are smaller in their mass to their ratio, right? So it means that if the surface is so large on children and their mass and muscles being smaller to that ratio, it means that they can be in the water less time before they get hypothermic. So just think about that. They are just smaller. They can't defend their temperature for a very long time. But in this study, they saw that for up to, I think it was a minute or so. They could
1 minute.
1 minute, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned hypothermia and smaller bodied people, children. I used to do some Pacific Ocean swims in the morning without wetsuits, and I adapted to it pretty quickly. And these are fairly long swims, and we brought an excellent swimmer with us that was interning with me for a while. He's 16 years old at the time and very lean, and he wasn't small for his age, but he was smaller than us. Yeah. There was all guys on this swim that day. Sometimes women join us, and he got hypothermic. And he's an excellent swimmer, and he didn't report feeling overly cold, but fortunately we got him to shore and heated him up again. So he lived. I don't think his mother's going to ever let him go swimming with us again. He's thriving in the world. He's a university student now. And he recalls that swim. I mean, this is why you always want to ocean swim with a buddy, with people. He became hypothermic. His teeth turned yellow. He was kind of slurring his words. He wasn't making sense. We got him onto shore and he was kind of, drooling and a little bit semi-euphoric. And then kind of, it was, hypothermia is no joke. So I think,
no joke.
So I'm really glad that this is coming up because the cold is a powerful stimulus and kids are and smaller bodied people are at a greater risk of hypothermia. So a good reason to approach it with caution, maybe
Very
start
cautious.
with cold showers, then cold immersion in still water. Natural water and open bodies of water, of course, are always going to be more dangerous for other reasons, currents and things of that sort.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And drowning,
So important note there. What about any additional male-female differences or similarities that we should be aware of? And this comes up all the time on social media. Anytime I post anything about a study, it's what about women? Because oftentimes there are differences.
And there are, we also just talked about the difference in temperature in men and women. So it means that if we replicated my study in women, it could be that they would have enough, you can say, cold exposure with just 9 minutes per week. It could be because they apparently are also just colder and they have increased metabolism in their brown fat. It's just they have more brown fat. It could be, but this is just something that I frankly don't know. But women also do cold exposure, winter swimming with the 11 minutes protocol. I do it myself and feel good about it. So I would say that women also regarding activation of the brown fat, it should be the same. In theory, but I don't know if women actually do need to have another protocol when it comes to this rapid cold exposure. I think that it's another question if we are talking about ice swimming, when it comes to how far can you be in the cold water without getting hypothermic, then there will be differences in men and female. But if you do this cold exposure for a very brief amount of time, which is what I try to talk about what we call also micro stressing the body to increase the hormetic stress, the healthy stress, then this is such a short amount of exposure that it's fairly the same. I think women can look at this as a fairly good protocol for them as well.
I always say that if you really dread the cold and don't like the cold, then you are a perfect candidate for using deliberate cold exposure because the sympathetic, aka the stress response, will be greater, and thereby the adaptation to that shorter 1 or 2 minutes is going to be much greater, right? For people that are perfectly comfortable in the cold, it's harder to get an adaptation response. The same way that if somebody's very strong and they can lift a very heavy weight, that very heavy weight is unlikely to evoke the same kind of same degree of adaptive responses if somebody is not quite as strong. Yes. So another reason to keep these exposures relatively short and more frequent than to do longer duration exposures frequently. However, let's say somebody only had 2 days a week to do deliberate cold exposure. Maybe they don't have access to a sauna. Maybe they do. Would you suggest that they get in for 1 or 2 minutes, then get out, then get back in for another couple of minutes, then get out and call that 4 or 5 minutes to try and get to that 11 minutes total per week, as opposed to getting in for a full 5 minutes and then getting out and coming back a second time that week? I know this is getting down into the weeds, but these are the sorts of things that I think people really want to know, because a lot of people either don't live close to a body of water or don't have a cold plunge that they can do this with, although cold shower apparently works too. So most people live close to a shower.
Yeah, so definitely. I think the changes in temperature is what is strengthening your cells in the body. So if you can do the short amount of exposure and then get out and get back in, that is gonna, you can say, strengthen your cells because you are challenging them to adapt to changing temperatures. Mm-hmm. So during one session, you can change this, right? You can do it if you are able to go to cold water, but also a sauna. Then you just do it that automatically. You will have a change in temperature. But you could also do it by varying the temperature in your cold plunge if you have a plunge, or if you have the open sea, or you have seasons even. We have that in Denmark. So we have 4 seasons, and the temperature is going to vary with that. So we have nature who can just changed this for us and we don't have to think about it. But if you have a cold plunge, well, then I would say that changing the temperature is what is going to create this hormetic stress and also keep your cells on its toes, you can say, because the body will still be stressed to try to adapt to the new temperature, as it's seen as something actually toxic to the body, right? It's a small piece of toxicity that you are exposing yourself to. You don't have to swallow it, but it's enough that you touch it, actually.
Yeah, great way to frame it. That brings me back to this idea of circadian time. In your study, you didn't control for a specific time of day. And now I'm realizing that may be a great asset to the whole thing. So we know, for instance, that our bodies go through pretty dramatic shifts in temperature from the time we wake up. Our body starts heating up as we wake up and continues to heat until the afternoon and then starts to drop in the later afternoon. And then assuming all things are working correctly, that body temperature drops and we sleep. So I could imagine that doing deliberate cold exposure at different times, just by way of convenience or by way of intention, could be very beneficial because my body temperature is going to be quite a bit warmer at one time of day versus another. And in that way, keeping the system tuned. And that's really what I keep hearing coming through as you explain these data and all these beautiful studies, yours and others, is that it's not really about getting cold. It's about going from warm to cold and from cold to warm. It's not it. And I love this idea because I probably said this 100 times on my podcast and 1,000,000 times in my life, and I'll continue to, which is that biology is not an event, it's a process. Like these metabolic and thermoregulatory processes are indeed like the turning of a knob. It's a verb. Yeah. It's as opposed to a noun. And so I think if people can internalize that idea, that they're going to have a lot more flexibility, a lot more fun, and get a lot more benefit, as opposed to thinking, okay, I need to get into X degrees of water for X amount of time on X number of days, in a very
I get this
rigid
question
way.
all the time. Yeah. How much and how cold? And I mean, it's just like, well, because we also don't have studies showing exactly if you just keep 5 degrees in your water and you do that for a month, then what happens? Maybe in the future we will know much more about this, and I'm sure it's going to come, and I really hope so. But I just think by logically changing that temperature up and down, and you also do that in your water, it's not that important what temperature you will have your water then just keep changing it, going up and down. It could be all up to 12 degrees Celsius. You're going to activate your brown fat anyways. I mean, 19 degrees cold air is enough to activate your brown fat. So maybe we don't have to go as cold as I think many people think, and putting ice even all the time. You don't have to. I don't think it's necessary to expose yourself to that cold temperature all the time, but vary it a bit.
So keep the system off balance, and
yes,
it's the way to keep it tuned.
Yeah.
You mentioned a study that is more recent or an ongoing that's not published. Or, if you're willing, could you share maybe some of the data from that, findings from that study, with, of course, the cue to everybody that these are not yet published data, so that the conclusions could change, the data could change for that matter.
Yeah, so we haven't analyzed all the data yet, and I know from the study that we did publish that we would need to look more at the data. So I don't really have any results yet that I can share because we are still in very preliminary analysis. analysis of this, so I wouldn't know yet what to exactly say about it. But what we looked at was both men and women. So that's coming.
Oh, that's fantastic. That answer is going to please a great number of people and intrigue everybody. So, well, listen, I want to really thank you for coming here today to talk about your work and the incredible direction that it points to. Because I think that, no one study is definitive, but your study really, again, stands as a landmark in the landscape of exploring deliberate cold exposure and heat, how it can impact and potentially impact our health. Because frankly, there just haven't been that many high resolution, detailed modern studies of this. There have been studies of sauna. There have been some studies of cold. There are a lot of groups in physiology that work on hypothermia and very cold exposure, but most of the temperatures used in those studies just aren't practical. So first of all, I just want to thank you for doing the work that you've done and for the work that you continue to do. I'm waiting with bated breath, as they say, to hear the results of this study that's ongoing on both men and women. So we'll have to have you back to inform us about that soon. And I want to thank you for the incredible public education efforts that you've been doing on social media with respect to your book. And we, of course, will put links to all of those things in the show note caption so people can learn from you and can continue to learn from you. We certainly need more scientists who are both experienced with doing hardcore research, as it's called, and who also do the practices. I think that's a wonderful additional asset. You're not just behind a lab coat or bundled up in a down feather jacket as everyone else is getting into the cold. You do these things, and that you are so open and generous in the way that you share knowledge, which includes coming here today to share knowledge with me and our audience. So thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. I am so pleased to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I could explain my study and I can share some of my insights from doing that. So I'm very grateful for being here.
Delighted, and we'll have to have you back again. Thank you for joining me for today's discussion all about deliberate cold and deliberate heat exposure, science and protocols with Dr. Susanna Søberg. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Søberg's research, or you would like to learn about the research of her institute, the Søberg Institute, please see the links in the show note caption. Also in the show note caption, you can find a link to Dr. Søberg's excellent book, Winter Swimming. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and Apple. And in addition, on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions for me or topics you'd like me to cover on the Huberman Lab podcast or guests that you'd like me to consider inviting on the Huberman Lab podcast, please put that in the comments on YouTube. I do read all the comments. In addition, please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. Not so much on today's episode, but on various previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discuss supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like enhancing sleep, focus, and hormone support. The Huberman Lab podcast is proud to have partnered with Momentous Supplements. If you'd like to hear more about the supplements discussed on the Huberman Lab podcast, please go to livemomentous, spelled OUS.com/Huberman. Again, that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. If you're not already following the Huberman Lab podcast on social media, we are Huberman Lab on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And on all those places, I focus on material that somewhat overlaps with content from the Huberman Lab podcast, but often is distinct from the content covered on the Huberman Lab podcast. So again, it's Huberman Lab on all social media channels. For those of you that haven't already subscribed to our so-called Neural Network newsletter, this is a completely zero-cost monthly newsletter that has summaries of podcast episodes and so-called toolkits. Toolkits are lists of about a page to 2 pages long that give the critical tools, for instance, for optimizing sleep or for neuroplasticity or deliberate cold exposure or deliberate heat exposure, optimizing dopamine. Again, all available to you at zero cost. You simply go to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu tab in the corner, scroll down to newsletter. You provide us your email. We do not share your email with anybody. And in addition to that, there are samples of toolkits on the hubermanlab.com website, again, under newsletter, and you don't even have to sign up to access those. But I think most people do end up signing up for the newsletter because it's rich with useful information and, again, completely zero cost. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion with Dr. Susanna Søberg. And last, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.